Once upon a time, there was a young woman called Wanda. She lived in a small village on the outskirts of Verona in northern Italy. Wanda was a very beautiful young woman. She had glorious, dark, wavy hair falling onto her shoulders, intense eyes with a twinkle of mischief when she looked at you, a smile that would warm up the room, and a laugh that would just lift anybody's spirit. Now, in this little village, it was the 1940s, so war was raging all over Europe and all over Italy. But this little village was quite tranquil and mostly unaffected by the war, until the war came to the village. The war came to the village in the form of German troops being stationed there. So all these soldiers arrived, young men a long way from home, who really had no choice in being there. They'd just been shipped across. And amongst those young men was a man called Frederika. His friends called him Fritz. And Fritz was a very attractive young man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, blonde, just absolutely gorgeous to look at. And one day, Fritz was strolling along the village piazza, and he heard this laugh, this beautiful, melodious laugh. And as he looked across, his and Wanda's eyes met. Well, that twinkle in her eye just got him straight away, and it was love at first sight. Now, it got towards the end of the war, so this blossoming, burgeoning relationship of theirs became very tricky. Because being an Italian woman in a relationship with a German man at the end of World War II was not a great position to be in. So they kept it secret, and they kept it very quiet. But one day, Fritz was at Wanda's house, and this happened. Big, scary knock at the door. Wanda, open the door, you need to let me in. It's not really a good time, could you come back? No, right now, you need to let me in, it's important. What's a girl to do? She just turned around, looked at Fritz and went, under the bed, quick, hide. So there he was, 6'4", blonde, broad-shouldered, strapping young German man hiding under this bed. It was the priest. Now, Italian Catholic priest in a tiny little village. He knew everything and everyone, and he knew everything about everyone. So he wasn't fooled. He found Fritz straight away. He knew what was going on. And he sat Wanda and Fritz down and he said, look, I understand you're in love. You're young and you're happy and you want to be together. But this is not going to happen unless Fritz can legally stay in Italy. You need to turn yourself over to the authorities, Fritz. You need to actually get the paperwork to stay. Turning yourself over to the authorities meant going into an internment camp. It wasn't a great prospect. But eventually the priest convinced them, so Fritz and Wanda said their goodbyes with trepidation and worry, and Fritz went off, handed himself over to the authorities and into a camp to be registered, where he stayed for a few months. Meanwhile, Wanda was still at home, but things were not so easy for her either. All over Europe, women who had consorted with the enemy, women who had had relationships with German soldiers, were being branded as collaborators and traitors. And this wasn't great. Now, most of them were like Wanda. They were simply women who were young and had fallen in love. But to be labelled a collaborator and a traitor meant that you would be dragged into a public square, have your head shaved, be tarred and feathered, be made to do the Nazi salute in front of everybody, and have things thrown at you, abuse hurled at you, and just be completely humiliated, at best. Luckily, the priest was very influential in the village, and he managed to pull some strings, and he managed to save Wanda from this fate. And eventually, Fritz came back, and he had his paperwork. He could stay in Italy. So they moved away from the little village, and they moved south to Rome, to the big city where they had all the opportunities. And they built a life for themselves. They got married. Wanda became German in the process, and they got married and they had children, and they had 3 daughters. Their eldest daughter, Katja, She took after her dad. She had a flair for languages. She was the only one of the 3 daughters that ever became fluent in German. And she went off to university and she studied languages. And eventually, after she'd been holding down 2 jobs working for the local council and looking after her daughter and also trying to just basically run the family and everything else, she got a brilliant opportunity. It was 1974. And the fledgling European Parliament in Luxembourg was recruiting. They wanted translators, they wanted hordes of these translators from all European countries that were member countries. So she sat months of tests and exams and interviews, and she got in. She got in, so off she went to Luxembourg, initially leaving her 2-year-old daughter behind in Rome with Wanda and Fritz so that she could get settled in, and then she took her daughter with her. And eventually she had another daughter as well, and both her daughters grew up in this bizarre place that is Luxembourg, cosmopolitan, international, multilingual, looks a bit like Switzerland. And they went to the European school there, where they learned languages, and they interacted with people from different nationalities, sometimes all in the same conversation in different languages. And where they got this outlook of go out into the world and do and meet people. And it got to 1990. And Katja's eldest daughter needed to look at options to go to university. There was no university in Luxembourg, so that one was out of the picture. But she could have gone to Italy, or France, or Germany, or possibly the UK, because she was fluent in all of those languages. And having looked at all the different systems, Katja's daughter decided that she wanted to go to the UK. She loved the university system there. She loved the music, she loved the culture, pop culture especially, and she'd always felt this affinity towards the UK that she couldn't explain. She just felt this pull. So she went, following in her mother's footsteps, leaving her country behind where she'd grown up and moved to the UK. And she came to Yorkshire. She went to Bradford, actually. And she fell in love straight away. She fell in love with Yorkshire, and who wouldn't? It's a beautiful place, isn't it? She fell in love with Yorkshire, and at the end of her first year at university, like her grandmother Wanda and her grandfather Fritz, she also fell in love. She fell in love with a young man. And so they started this relationship. By the time it got to her final year at university, there was no way that Katja's daughter was going to return to Luxembourg or do what she'd originally planned to do, which was to actually move to Italy, perhaps. Certainly better weather than in Yorkshire, at the very least. But she wanted to stay, and she wanted to make her life here in Yorkshire with the person who is now still her husband. So over nearly 28 years together, they built a life, they developed their careers, they bought a house or 2 as time went on, and they had 2 daughters. And their daughters are now young women in their own right who have the privilege of being Italian and German and British. And all of that entails in terms of the mix of cultures and foods and languages and the wonderful holidays visiting, particularly Italy, all over the place. And so the story continues from Wanda and Fritz, who met under those very difficult circumstances. Now, as you might have worked out, as it is Tales from the Family Tree, Wanda and Fritz were my grandparents. I knew them simply as Nonna Wanda and Opa Fritz. But I think that Nonna Wanda and Opa Fritz were everyday heroes, the things they had to endure at their very young ages just to be together, just to stay together. They were certainly stubborn as well. And I'm very grateful for that stubbornness that they showed and that determination and that passion and that love, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. So I'm very lucky because I was able to meet Simon and stay with Simon without having to go through what they went through. It was much easier for us. We weren't at war, even though we were in different nationalities, and we didn't have to face the fear of being put into camps, etc. So this is why I do what I do now at the moment, not professionally, but in my personal life. With every ounce of my being, I fight to keep Britain in the European Union, and I know that's not always a popular point of view, but I do this because I was able to take advantage of the ability to live and love and travel and work and study in any one of 28 countries. And whatever happens, I'll still be able to do that in 27. But my children and their children won't if Brexit goes ahead. And for that reason, and the 3.5 million other EU citizens that live in the UK, and the 1.7 million British citizens that live in European countries, who are in limbo like me right now, who have been for the last 2 years, I will keep fighting to try and stop Brexit. Thank you very much for listening to my story.